At a humble diner on the outskirts of town, a black waiter wipes down a table when he spots a homeless man huddled against the cold outside. Moved by compassion, he uses his own money to buy the starving man a meal. But his act of kindness ignites the fury of his manager, her voice sharp, laced with prejudice, as she dismisses the homeless man as nothing more than a nuisance. As tensions rise, an unexpected truth is revealed. The homeless man holds far more power than his appearance suggests, and tonight, one decision will change the future of the diner forever. The evening air clung to the streets like a damp blanket, cold enough to bite through jackets and make breath visible in thin clouds. The city hummed softly in the distance, a blend of distant sirens, honking horns, and the low murmur of tired conversations. Street lights flickered above cracked sidewalks, their glow barely strong enough to push back the dark. Inside Sunny Diner, the world felt warmer, not luxurious but inviting. The faded checkered floor bore the scuff marks of years of hurried footsteps. Booth seats were patched in places, their vinyl cracked from overuse. Grease-stained menus sat on tables that wobbled slightly if leaned on too hard. The air smelled like grilled meat, fresh coffee, and a faint trace of lemon cleaner, familiar scents that somehow felt like comfort. Darnell liked that smell. It reminded him of home, or at least the idea of it. As he wiped down a table near the window, he glanced outside. The man stood there, gaunt, hunched, his face half-hemmed beneath the shadow of a worn-out cap. His coat, oversized and frayed, hung from his thin frame like a loose tarp. The man's eyes, hollow and tired, fixated on a plate of fries inside the diner. His gaze lingered, not just with hunger, but with something deeper, something desperate. Darnell paused, gripping the damp rag in his hand. He knew that look. Moments later, he was at the counter. He didn't ask permission, didn't think twice. He grabbed a plate from the warmer, a grilled cheese sandwich with a side of fries, still steaming, and poured a glass of water. "What are you doing?" The sharp voice hit him before he'd even turned around. Melissa's heels tapped briskly against the tile as she crossed the room, her face twisted in irritation. She wasn't shouting. Melissa never shouted, but her voice carried an edge that cut deeper than volume. Her eyes flicked down to the plate in his hands, then snapped to the window where the man still stood. "Tell me you're not about to waste food on some homeless junkie, especially one of those." Darnell's grip tightened around the plate. "He's hungry," he said quietly. Melissa snorted, an ugly, bitter sound. "Oh, I'm sure he is. And what happens after you feed him? He brings his buddies and suddenly this place is full of beggars and junkies? That's not the image we want." "Melissa?" Darnell's voice stayed calm, but his chest tightened. "It's one plate of food. One plate becomes 10, then 20, then suddenly this place is crawling with junkies and, well, let's just say we stop being a diner and start looking like a soup kitchen in the ghetto." Her words lingered in the air, sharp and cold. "We throw away more than this every night," Darnell muttered, turning back toward the door. Melissa's hand shot out, gripping his arm tightly. "We throw it away because it's garbage," she hissed. "Not hand it to beggars like they actually belong in here. What's next? Hiring them too?" Darnell turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "He's not garbage." Melissa's expression hardened. "Oh, please." Her voice dropped, low enough that only Darnell could hear. "Look at him. He's probably drunk or high or worse. People like that. They make choices. And this?" She pointed sharply toward the window. "This is the result." Darnell's blood turned hot beneath his skin. This wasn't new. It was the same old poison, just coming from a different mouth. "People like what?" His voice was still low, but the warning in it was unmistakable. Melissa leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "Don't play dumb with me," she sneered. "You people are always playing the victim, acting like the world owes you something. Like I said, some of us work for what we have." For a moment, neither moved. The low murmur of the diners seemed to fade away, swallowed by the tension. Finally, Darnell reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill and slapped it down on the counter. "I'll pay for it." His voice was tight, controlled. "Out of my own pocket." Melissa scoffed. You really think that changes anything? She said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. You think one sandwich makes you some kind of savior? It makes me better than you, Darnell snapped, because at least I know what it means to have a soul. He started toward the door. Darnell, stop. The voice that interrupted this time wasn't Melissa's. It was softer, rougher, the man outside. He had stepped forward, his face now fully visible beneath the flickering streetlight. Lines carved deep into his pale skin, and his beard, patchy and unkempt, barely masked the exhaustion in his features. I don't want to cause trouble, the man rasped. His voice sounded dry, like he hadn't had water in hours. I just wanted something to eat. For a moment Darnell hesitated. Something about the man's voice seemed off, too steady, too sure for someone so broken. But before he could say anything, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Howard, the general manager, stood with his arms crossed, his sharp eyes flicking between Darnell, Melissa, and the man outside. What's going on here? Melissa's face lit up like a child tattling to a teacher. Darnell thought it'd be a great idea to start feeding every vagrant who stares through the window, she said with mock sweetness. Apparently we're just giving out free food now. Howard's gaze shifted to Darnell. That true? Darnell straightened his shoulders. I paid for it, he said firmly. For a moment Howard said nothing. His expression gave away nothing, no anger, no approval, just cold calculation. Then, without looking away, he spoke. Everyone, meeting, now. Melissa smirked like she'd just won a prize. Darnell set the plate down on the counter, his heart sinking. Outside, the man in the worn-out jacket lingered a moment longer, watching the scene unfold. Then, slowly, he smiled. A small, knowing smile, before turning back into the shadows. The break room of Sunny Diner was small and cluttered, a cramped space tucked behind the kitchen where employees went to escape the relentless churn of the diner floor. A flickering fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a harsh white glow on the battered lockers and the tiny scarred table in the center of the room. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and fryer grease. Darnell sat stiffly in one of the rickety chairs, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Across from him, Melissa leaned back against the counter, arms folded, the smirk on her face just subtle enough to be infuriating. Howard stood between them, unreadable as always, his sharp gaze darting between the two employees before finally settling on Darnell. So, Howard said, his voice low, measured, you want to tell me what the hell happened out there? Darnell swallowed the heat rising in his throat. He knew how this was going to go. He'd seen it play out too many times before. A man was hungry, he said evenly. I wanted to help. Melissa scoffed, tilting her head in mock amusement. Right, because it's your job to decide who gets fed and who doesn't. She turned toward Howard, feigning concern. Honestly, I don't even know why we're having this conversation. He stepped out of line, plain and simple. But I guess that's expected, huh? Always looking for handouts, never knowing your place. Howard didn't react. He just kept watching, silent, waiting. Darnell forced himself to stay calm. I paid for it myself, he said, his voice tight. This wasn't the diner's loss. That's not the point, Melissa snapped. It's the message it sends. You give a handout to one, and next thing you know, we've got an entire lineup of them out front. This place turns into a damn shelter, and real customers don't want to walk through that. Real customers? Darnell repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Melissa shrugged. The ones who actually pay for their meals. You know, the people who don't smell like garbage and don't make everyone else uncomfortable just by existing. Darnell stared at her, his stomach twisting. So what, Melissa? His voice was steady, but there was an edge beneath it now. You think just because someone doesn't have money they don't deserve to eat? You think they're less than you? Melissa let out a slow, amused chuckle. Oh, don't act so surprised, Darnell. People like you always love playing the hero, but at the end of the day we both know who's on top. A slow, hot rage burned in Darnell's chest. It took everything in him not to let it spill out. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't naive. He knew exactly what she was saying beneath those words. Howard exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple like he was already exhausted by this conversation. All right, enough, he said. He turned toward Melissa. Take a break. I need to talk to Darnell alone. Melissa blinked, clearly caught off guard. Wait, what? Why do I have to? Now, Howard repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Melissa huffed, pushing off the counter. As she passed Darnell, she leaned in just enough to murmur, "You're really making this difficult for yourself, you know that?" Then she was gone, the door swinging shut behind her with a dull thud. Silence filled the room, heavy and oppressive. Howard sighed, dragging a chair out and sitting across from Darnell. He didn't speak right away, just studied him, his fingers tapping idly against the table. "You're a good worker," he said finally. "I've never had complaints about you. You do your job, you show up on time. So tell me, why are you putting your neck out for this?" Darnell's jaw tightened. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. Howard leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. "The right thing doesn't always keep the doors open." "And the wrong thing doesn't make this place worth working for?" Darnell shot back. A flicker of something crossed Howard's face, not quite agreement, but not dismissal either. "This is bigger than you realize," Howard said after a long pause. Darnell frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" But before Howard could answer, the door creaked open. A new voice filled the room, low, rough, with a hint of something deliberate beneath it. "I think it means you should listen very carefully." Darnell turned sharply. The man from outside, the supposed homeless man, stood in the doorway, his posture now straighter, his eyes sharper. The exhaustion in his expression was still there, but something else had settled over it now, something calculating. Howard didn't look surprised. Darnell's stomach twisted. What the hell is going on? Darnell's pulse hammered against his ribs. The man who had stood outside just moments ago, frail and desperate, now carried himself with a quiet authority that didn't belong to someone beaten down by the streets. His shoulders squared, his voice no longer weak, no longer pleading. He wasn't asking for help anymore. He was here for something else. Howard didn't look surprised. "Darnell," Howard said, his voice carefully neutral, "meet Mr. Bradley." Darnell stared. "What?" The man stepped forward, his face calm but watchful, eyes flicking over Darnell like he was studying a puzzle, waiting for the pieces to click. Then, slowly, he reached up and peeled the worn-out cap from his head, revealing neatly combed gray hair beneath. The disheveled beard, too, was removed in a single practiced motion, exposing the clean-shaven face of a man who did not belong in alleyways or shivering outside diners. "I own this place," Bradley said simply. Silence. Darnell felt his breath leave him in a slow, stunned exhale. The weight of what was happening settled over him like bricks. "You—" His throat tightened. "This was all fake?" "A test," Howard admitted, rubbing his jaw like he'd been holding in the truth for too long. "To see what kind of people we've got working here." Melissa. Her words, the way she had sneered, the way she had dismissed the man outside like he was nothing. And Darnell had been the only one to push back. A slow, simmering heat curled in his stomach, not just at what had happened, but at what it revealed. "So you dressed up as a homeless man," Darnell said, his voice tight, "to bait us into showing you who we really are?" "It wasn't bait," Bradley corrected. "It was the truth. The only difference between me and any other man in that situation was your perception of me." His gaze sharpened. "And you're the only one who saw past that." Darnell clenched his fists. "Melissa failed," Bradley continued. "That much is clear, but you—" He nodded slightly, almost approvingly. "You stood up for something." The words should have felt like praise. They didn't. Darnell's head was spinning, anger creeping in around the edges. "So what now?" he said, voice low. "You call her in here, humiliate her, fire her in front of everyone, prove a point?" Bradley studied him for a moment before shaking his head. "I don't believe in ruining people. I believe in giving them a chance to change." Darnell exhaled slowly, forcing himself to sit back in his chair. "And me?" he asked, tone unreadable. Bradley's lips pressed together. "You already proved who you are," he said, his voice calm but firm, "and so did she." He turned to Melissa, his gaze cold. "I built this diner for everyone. If that's a problem for you, you can walk out that door right now." And just like that, everything changed. The break room felt smaller now, the air heavier with unspoken words. Darnell sat rigid in his chair, his mind still trying to catch up with what had just unfolded. Across from him, Mr. Bradley watched, his expression unreadable, while Howard leaned against the counter, arms crossed, waiting. It was quiet, save for the dull hum of the fluorescent light overhead. The weight of the past hour pressed down on Darnell's shoulders, thick and suffocating. "So, that's it?" Darnell's voice was low, edged with something he wasn't sure he could name. "You tested us. She failed. I passed. What now?" Bradley exhaled, leaning forward slightly, hands clasped on the table between them. "Now, we move forward." His voice was calm, measured, but it carried something firm beneath it, something final. "Melissa won't be fired, but she will be demoted. Effective immediately, she's no longer in a management position." Darnell's jaw tightened. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but part of him, maybe the part still burning from the way she had spoken, the way she had looked at him, had wanted more. "And me?" "You," Bradley said, eyes locking onto his, "are being promoted. Assistant manager, if you want it." The words landed heavily between them. Darnell blinked, his breath hitching for just a second before he masked the reaction. "You're serious?" "I don't waste time on things I'm not serious about," Bradley said simply. "You stood for something tonight, and that's the kind of leadership this place needs. That I need." He let the words settle before continuing. "There's one more thing." Darnell stayed silent, waiting. "Starting this Friday and every Friday after that, we'll be implementing a new policy. 1 free meal per person for those who need it, no questions asked." A long pause. "You're turning the diner into a shelter?" Melissa's voice cut through the room before Darnell could respond. She stood in the doorway, stiff, arms folded tightly across her chest. She must have been listening, lingering outside long enough to hear the verdict. Darnell studied her face. She wasn't gloating anymore. There was no smirk, no sharpness in her eyes. Just tension. Uncertainty. "I'm turning it into what it should have been all along," Bradley corrected. "A place where all people can sit down and eat with dignity." Melissa's throat bobbed, but she said nothing. Bradley stood, smoothing out his shirt, his voice even. "Howard will handle the transition. You can all get back to work." And just like that, it was over. The shift dragged on, the weight of what had happened hanging over the diner like a low storm cloud. Word spread quickly. Employees whispering in corners, customers casting curious glances at Melissa as she moved through the floor. Her presence no longer carrying the same authority. Darnell kept his head down, doing his job, but he could feel her watching him. And when the last few customers trickled out, when the neon open sign flickered off for the night, he found her near the counter wiping down menus with slow, distracted motions. He approached carefully, voice measured. "You don't have to like me, but I hope you at least understand why things played out the way they did." Melissa's hands stilled. For a moment she didn't speak. Then her jaw clenched, and for the first time Darnell saw something in her eyes that looked almost like shame. "I never thought I was that kind of person," she muttered, barely above a whisper. "But maybe I didn't want to see it." Darnell studied her for a moment before nodding. "It's never too late to change." She let out a weak, humorless laugh. "Guess I don't have much of a choice now, do I?" "Guess not." The next week passed with a strange kind of energy, the diner shifting, evolving. The first Friday meal night arrived without fanfare. No advertisements, no announcements. Just a quiet sign on the window, handwritten in blocky letters. "If you're hungry, come inside. Dinner's on us." People came. Not in droves, not all at once, but they came. One of them was Marcus. Darnell recognized him the second he walked in. Thin, weathered, wearing the kind of exhaustion that clung to a person's bones. He expected hesitation, an awkward pause, but before he could step forward, someone else did. Melissa. She grabbed a menu, approached without hesitation, her expression unreadable. "What can I get you tonight?" she asked, voice steady. Marcus blinked, like he wasn't sure if she was serious. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat. Just coffee would be fine. Melissa shook her head. Nah, you should eat something. We've got a great meatloaf special tonight. She offered a small, almost uncertain smile. It's on the house. Darnell, watching from across the room, let the corner of his mouth tug upward just slightly. Change didn't happen overnight. But sometimes all it took was one moment to start it. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.